Our presentation title is Regional Identity and Architectural Translations. It's examining the institutionalization of Minangkabau vernacular in Lembaga Muzium Negeri Sembilan. In this presentation, we explore how vernacular architecture is being used in modern buildings and what this tells us about the regional identity in Malaysia. Lembaga Muzium Negeri Sembilan is a good case study because its design clearly refers to Minangkabau architecture, especially through its roof forms and cultural image. However, the key question is whether this translation is only visual or if it also keeps the original building logics. In this presentation, we argue that the museum keeps the visual identity of Minangkabau architectures but changes much of its original material, structural, and climatic logic. To study this, we will first explain the theory, then look at the vernacular foundation, and finally analyze how it's translated into the museum.
So, due to the lack of a clear architectural identity in Malaysia, vernacular architecture is often used as a source of symbolic national and regional representation. Malaysian architecture reflects multiple cultural influences and historical layers. There is no any single clearly defined national architectural identity. So the contemporary architecture is frequently shaped by the global modernist influences. This has resulted in many buildings appearing generic and lacking a strong sense of places. So the Malaysia and Indonesia share strong cultural and historical connection, especially through the movement of people and tradition across the region. One important example is Minangkabau culture, which originally comes from the West Sumatra in Indonesia. Through migration period, this culture was brought into Negeri Sembilan and gradually became part of the local identity. So as a result, both regions share certain architectural forms, symbols, and traditions. However, the Minangkabau identity seen in Negeri Sembilan is not a direct copy of West Sumatra. Instead, it is a localized adaptation that has been reshaped by the local context, needs, and cultural settings.
In this part, we'll explain the vernacular foundation of Minangkabau architecture. Vernacular architecture is not just a traditional image, it is shaped by history, culture, climate, and constructions. In Negeri Sembilan, Minangkabau architecture is important not only because of how it looks, but also because it represents regional identity and social life. To understand the museum, we first need to look at the history and culture of the Minangkabau architecture in Negeri Sembilan. This architectural tradition comes through migrations and long-term settlements, and over time it becomes adapted to the local context. It is closely linked to the adat perpati, where architecture reflects family structure, culture, and community life. So Minangkabau architecture is not just about how the building looks, it is a cultural system that expresses regional identity, which is later reused in the museum. In this part, I will talk why the roof becomes a strong identity symbol of it. The roof is the most recognizable elements of Minangkabau architecture. Its curved shape is strongly linked to the cultural identity and is easily recognized. But the roof is not only a symbol. In traditional architecture, it's also helped with land protections, ventilations, and spatial organizations. Because it's very visible, the roof is often used in modern buildings like the museums. It becomes a strong visual symbol of identity. However, focusing too much on the roof can simplify the architecture into just an image, especially when the original structure and material logics are no longer fully kept. In this part, I will talk about climatic and tectonic logics. Minangkabau architecture is important not only for how it looks, but also for how it works. In traditional house, forms, material, and structure all work together as one system. Climatically, the building responds to the tropical environments. Features like stepped roof, large overhang, less floor, and opening help with shading, airflow, and rain protections. Structurally, the house is built using timber, columns, beam, and just are the part of the designs and are purely expressed. The roof is not just added on top, but comes from the structure itself. So vernacular architecture is not just a visual style, it's a complete system that combines climate, material, and structure. This becomes important when we compare it to the museums, where the form is kept but the original building logic is changed.
Section examines Lembaga Muzium Negeri Sembilan as a case study to understand how Minangkabau vernacular architecture is translated within an institutional context. Rather than evaluating the building only a cultural symbol, the analysis focuses on how vernacular elements are adapted, transformed, or reinterpreted in terms of form, climate response, and construction logic. Go to case study introduction. Lembaga Muzium Negeri Sembilan is a state museum that represents the cultural heritage of Negeri Sembilan. As a public institutional building, it plays an important role in presenting and formalizing regional identity. Architecturally, the museum adopts a design language that is strongly inspired by Minangkabau vernacular architecture, particularly through its roof form and overall composition. However, as an institutional building, it operates at a different scale, function, and construction system compared to traditional vernacular houses. This makes it an important case to examine whether vernacular identity is preserved as a lived architectural system or translated into a symbolic and representational form. Focus on the tapak perpati, which is the main building. The main building, known as the tapak perpati, clearly reflects the influence of Minangkabau architecture through its distinctive curved roof form. The form is often associated with the image of buffalo horns, which has strong cultural symbolism within Minangkabau tradition. In the museum, the roof form functions as a visual marker of identity, allowing the building to be immediately recognized as culturally rooted in Negeri Sembilan. However, this translation operates primarily as a visual level. While the form is retained, the building no longer follows the same material and structural logic. as traditional vernacular houses. As a result, the roof becomes an applied architectural image rather than a direct expression of the original tectonic system. To climate design, in terms of climate response, the museum incorporates several features that are similar to vernacular architecture. This includes extend roof overhang, high roof volumes, and opening that allows for natural ventilation. These elements contribute to shading and airflow, which are important in a tropical climate. However, these strategies are only partially retained. Unlike the traditional house, where climate response is fully integrated into the construction system, the museum applies these features in a more selective and adapted manner. This suggests that while environmental considerations are present, they do not fully reproduce the original climate intelligence of the vernacular architecture. 1 to 4.4 and 4.5 traditional building in the complex. Within the museum complex, traditional buildings such as Istana Ampang Tinggi and Muzium Negeri Sembilan are also present. These buildings serve as important reference as they retain more of the original vernacular construction methods, materials, and spatial organization. By comparing these structures with the museum building, it becomes possible to distinguish that between authentic vernacular tectonic system and their institutional reinterpretation. This comparison highlights the difference between architecture as a lived cultural practice and architecture as a curated representation.
So the Lembaga Muzium Negeri Sembilan is referring to the traditional construction method of rumah gadang. This rumah gadang have several important features, which is raising on tilts, which is the house standing on their timber posts above the ground for stability, airflow, and protection. And also the modular structural grade system. The structure is arranged in a clear repetitive grade system, making the building organized and extendable. Next one is the layered roof support system, which is the dramatic curved roof is carried by an upper system of posts and beams. Last one is the joint timber elements, which is the structural parts are connected through traditional timber joinery, forming an integrated frame. So these are the 9 phases, which showing how the rumah gadang is being built. The phase 1, erect the first main structural frame, so-called jarak. They consist of 4 main posts, tonggak, and the horizontal beams. The tiang makelar is added to support the roof structure and underfloor coverings. And phase 2, erect the remaining structural frames on both sides. Numbering of frames depends on the required house size and functions. In phase 3, connect all the frames with longitudinal beams. Place the ridge beam, which so-called knob in the Malay terms, on top of it. At phase 4, insert stone bases, which so-called sandis, under the post. The posts are lifted one by one during installation. At phase 5, install the roof frame, includes curved beams, rafters, and slats. While in the phase 6, add the roof covering, traditionally thatched, now often zinc sheets. In phase 7, install the wooden floorboards, supported by the secondary beams. While in the phase 8, build the walls and the enclosure elements, add wall boards, supporting beams, and the underfloor coverings. In the last phase 9, install the wooden staircase. By referencing to the construction method of rumah gadang, both the Lembaga Muzium Negeri Sembilan and rumah gadang share structural similarities, which is stated below. So firstly is the Lembaga Muzium Negeri Sembilan is elevated on stilts. Secondly, its structural system is arranged in repetitive grid along the horizontal span. Lastly is the decorative wood carvings are incorporated throughout, including perforated screens panels along the side walkway and also the carved element affixed to the walls. And this is our 3D modeling animation video, which represents the detail more clearly.
So now let's move on to part number 5, which is critical discussion, symbolic versus structural translation. So traditional versus museum. When comparing traditional Minangkabau architecture with the museum, a key difference emerges in the relationship between form, structure, and material. So in the traditional house, these elements are fully integrated into a single system, where the architectural form is directly generated by constructional logic and material properties. So in contrast, the museum separates these relationships, so the visual form, particularly the roof, is retained, but the underlying structural and material systems are significantly transformed. This indicates a shift from architecture as an integrated system to architecture as a representational composition. So another one is loss of tectonic logic. So one of the most significant transformations in the museum is the loss of tectonic logic. So in vernacular architecture, tectonic logic refers to the integration of form, material, and construction into a coherent system. The timber structure, joinery, and roof form all work together and as a part of unifying structural expression. So in the museum, this relationship is altered. The building is constructed using modern materials such as reinforced concrete, and also the roof form is no longer structurally generated in the same way. So as a result, the original construction between form and construction is weakened. So the architecture retains the appearance of Minangkabau identity, but not the underlying tectonic principles that originally produced it. So this demonstrates that the translation of vernacular architecture in the museum operates more at the level of image than construction. So this further leads to the idea of symbolic translation. In Lembaga Muzium Negeri Sembilan, vernacular architecture is translated into a symbolic language that emphasizes the visual recognition and cultural representation. So the roof form in particular becomes a very dominant visual element that communicates identity even when the original material and tectonic logic are no longer present. So as a result, the vernacular architecture is reduced from a lived and functional system into a curated and representational image. So this reflects a broader process of institutionalization where architecture is used to formalize and display cultural identity rather than to embody the full complexity of vernacular knowledge. So in conclusion, Lembaga Muzium Negeri Sembilan shows how Minangkabau architecture is translated into an institutional building. Also, while the museum keeps the visual identity, especially the roof form, this translation is mainly symbolic. So the original tectonic material and climatic logic is not fully retained, and this suggests the regional identity today is often expressed through image rather than construction.